Well, good morning, good morning, good morning. It's Barry Jones with SB History, and I am speaking this morning from lovely Austin, Texas. And I am in the Austin Public Library downtown, the Central Library. It is a beautiful library. I've You can kind of see over my shoulder the main concourse area. Looks like it's got about 6 or 7 floors. Uh, I've been in some pretty small town libraries to do these episodes on my travels. And this one so far is I thought the New Orleans library was nice, but Austin takes the cake so far. So, anyway, we are today beginning a new chapter in the study of the deep state. We've already talked about the formation of the deep state, what it was. We defined it as the national security apparatus and all the industries that fed it. And of course, the time period that we're looking at is the time period right after the conclusion of the Civil War up to the end of the Cold War. The deep state would have a different definition today. It has morphed into something bigger, more inclusive, more all-inclusive. But during the Cold War period, post World War I, World War II era, it was the national security apparatus and all the industries that feed it. And of course, the national security threat kept everybody on their toes was the threat of communism. Um, the second definition that we've been hammering home is the adoption by the public sector of a private sector doctrine called ultra vires. Ultra vires is the pursuit of profits at the expense of the public interest. And most importantly, the immunization of all those involved so that no one ever faces accountability. Uh, and, when that was a private sector phenomena, the American people could always at least feel safe in the fact that the knowledge of the fact that the public sector acted as a buffer against abuses by the private sector. But when ultravires bled over into, as a result of World War I, World War II, bled over into the public sector, the public interests got left in the rearview mirror, and it has been that way ever since. I I think if you understand that, it explains government today, why so many policies do not reflect the will of the people, why popular sovereignty is not reflected many times on election days. I could go on and on because government does not exist today to enact or carry out or defend the public interest. It is there to enact policies, defend policies, and uh, guarantee policies that benefit themselves, itself, and all of its interests. So you understand that, and it helps explain government. And then the fact that there's no accountability ever. And it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat, uh, seemingly. You're part of a unit party which protects each other. And the people, uh, there's accountability for the people. Try not paying your taxes. Try not showing up for a hearing when you've been subpoenaed. And I can go on and on and on. But government officials routinely do these things and get away with it because they have immunity. That is a very important doctrine to understand uh, in the history of our country, in the history of this deep state, its formation, its movement from the private sector into the public sector, and its takeover and complete control over all public policy today. Ultravires. The third definition that we've been hammering home is the definition of treason. When these deep staters began their treachery, it didn't rise to the level of treason. It wasn't ethical. It wasn't moral. It certainly wasn't acting in the public interest. It was very selfish and greedy and all the things, but it wasn't treason. But at some point, it crossed the Rubicon into treason. So, what is treason? Treason is the betrayal of one's country. It is the willingness to fight or oppose one's own country, perhaps in a war. It is the betrayal of your country's people, uh, whereby you concoct a war and force other people's kids have to go fight and die for a made up war that you made up. It's the overthrow or attempted overthrow of your own government. It's the killing of the king of your own government. It's when you put yourself at odds and you have the power to make things happen that are at odds with your own government, with your own country. Again, if public interest doesn't matter, then your country's interests, which is made up of people, which is made up of the public, doesn't matter either. So those are the three important definitions to remember going forward as we continue on this discussion. The definition of deep state, the definition of ultravires, and the definition of treason. We have so far, if you've been with me, gone through several elements of this apparatus, this deep state apparatus, these power elites that by the time we get to 1963 are working together in a coalition, or what I call a cabal, a treasonous cabal. They've long since crossed the threshold of committing treason. They did that by propagandizing us into the Spanish-American War, committing an act of terror against our own soldiers at the USS Maine. They did that by propagandizing and killing American citizens, but to get us into World War I with the Lusitania. They did that again in World War II at Pearl Harbor by allowing an attack to happen on American soil, which of course killed American citizens and servicemen. All three of those eventually ended up in wars that killed American soldiers. Those are acts of treason. We got into World War II. We talked about the attempted overthrow by this deep state cabal of FDR's government. Okay, so we've seen several examples already where they're very willing to commit treason. And by the time we get through with World War I, this cabal has realized that the most lucrative business model out there is continuous warfare. So they say, if we ever get another one of these, we're not going to let it end because the money spigot is too great. We can't afford to turn it off next time. So World War II begets the Cold War, which within it are several proxy wars, Korea and Vietnam, and all the politics involved with that. And I have shown you in earlier episodes how one war just transitioned right into the next. And that became the business model and continues to this day. That was learned as a result of the world wars. And so here we are now. By the time we get to 1963, we're in the middle, we're in the thick of a Cold War with the Soviets, and we're on the precipice, seemingly. The planners have been planning a war in Korea and Vietnam. They got the one in Korea in the 50s. Now they're planning the next one in Vietnam. And absent some obstacles standing in their way, that figures to come to pass here shortly. So we've been looking at the deep state cabal, and I identified as the first piece of this cabal the CIA. And we went through a series of episodes detailing the CIA and its involvement in this treasonous cabal. Secondly, I identified as part of this national security apparatus, this treasonous cabal, is the Pentagon. And I went into its motivations for participating in this treasonous cabal. Then third, I took a time out from the national security apparatus to talk about the most necessary component of this assassination plot, which we all know we're going to end up in Dallas, November 22nd, 1963. That's where we're headed. And the most necessary component is the guy that can control the field of fire, the field of operations, which is Texas, and generally speaking, and specifically, it's Dallas. No one better illustrates or better controls the state of Texas than Lyndon Baines Johnson, who at this time is currently the Vice President of the United States. He has an iron grip on the state of Texas and by extension on Dallas. And if the plot succeeds, and he's willing to go along with it and participate to the extent that they need him to participate. He can control the investigations and everything that flows out from that. Washington, as the new president, he'll control Washington. And if he moves the investigation and the autopsy, all these things from Dallas to Washington, he and they together can keep tabs on everything, control the information that leaks out, and control the investigation and control who gets blamed. And of course, he's going to be useful in setting up the Warren Commission and arranging the autopsy at Bethesda, all these things, putting in people to investigate the Foxes, investigating the hen house, right? His best friend, J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI, the former CIA director, Alan Dulles, and the Warren Commission, on and on. No one is better situated to provide the immunity for the treasonous cabal than Lyndon Baines Johnson. And that's the importance of a plot like this, who, in addition to who did it, it's who had motive to do it. And of course, we talked about Lyndon Johnson's motives, which were to A, become president. He was never going to become president if he didn't participate in this plot. And number two, stay out of jail. Neither one of those were going to happen if he didn't participate in this plot. So he certainly had personal motive. But then he had intersecting relationships with all these other plotters. And today we're going to learn about another one of these intersecting relationships, and this the Secret Service. And so Johnson is really key. I call him the deep state's ultra vires guarantor, the guarantor of their immunity, of their ability to get away with this. He was the necessary component. And we talked about, in the addendum to LBJ, I talked about all the different payoffs that he was in position afterwards to make good on for all these different conspirators. And as president, he uniquely had that power. So today what I want to do is shift back to the national security apparatus and talk about the Secret Service, because if you don't have the Secret Service involved in this plot, it can't occur. It can't happen. And so that's what we're looking at today. The third aspect of the national security apparatus, the Secret Service. A little bit of history. This agency or function of our government wasn't always with us. On April 14th, 1865, this is what you talk about irony. Abraham Lincoln signed into existence, creating the Secret Service on April 14th, 1865. Later on that evening, he was assassinated. I mean, you just can't make that stuff up. July 5th, it was formally established, and now its original purpose was not necessarily to protect presidents. In fact, that it wasn't its mandate at all. Its original purpose was to protect the nation against counterfeiters. We were having a real problem with, especially at the conclusion of the Civil War. And so that was their job. They were officially part of the Department of Treasury, and they were to protect against counterfeiters. However, we had 3 assassinations in pretty short order. We'd gone all these years, from the 1700s to mid 1800s, about 100 years with no assassinations. Then all of a sudden, within a 35-year span, we have 3. And it was embarrassing. Here we are, a pretend superpower, right? We haven't quite reached that status yet, but we'd like to be recognized as a legitimate functioning government around the world, and we can't even protect our presidents. And so after William McKinley's assassination in 1901, Congress added the presidential protection to Secret Service responsibilities, and it's been that way ever since. And then from Teddy Roosevelt, who, if you remember the Teddy Roosevelt story, he inherited the presidency after McKinley died, and then someone took a shot at Teddy. Remember, he was giving that speech and he got shot, and it hit the copy of his speech they had in his pocket. He gave the rest of his speech while he's standing there bleeding, went to the hospital afterwards. And I think that's when he made that quote, "It's going to take more than a bullet to stop a bull moose." That's what his nickname was. Anyway, from Teddy Roosevelt on to Eisenhower, we have any problems. Now, Teddy had his little problem there, but he didn't die. So technically, that's not completely true. It'd be the president after Teddy, I guess Taft. But we went a long time from 1901 to 1963 with no problems. Not quite as long as we did prior to the Secret Service being created, but we did go about 60 years. And so that's how the Secret Service came into existence. Here are the three assassinations I said really uh, set the table for the Secret Service getting added to its mandate, the presidential protections, because in 1865 you have the president killed Lincoln on the same day he signed the Secret Service into existence. Uh, about 16 years later, President Garfield was killed by Charles Guiteau. And then in 1901, Leon Solgus kills President McKinley in 1901. Now, interestingly, all three of these happen. Uh, now, in the full scope of the history of our country, if these are the only three that happen, that means assassinations in America are rare. Of course, we know it's not it didn't end at three, but up until then, it seemed like we had kind of bottled up this problem. We'd fixed it. 18, the interesting thing about all three of these assassinations is they were fairly easily uh, solved as far as crimes are concerned because John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln in front of witnesses. And very afterwards, he jumped over the side, got his spur caught in the bunting on the theater there, and fell, broke his leg, jumped up and yelled something to the crowd. The whole crowd saw him, and they recognized him because he was a famous actor. In fact, some of them thought it was part of the play until Mary Todd started screaming from the booth up above. But anyway, lots of witnesses there. Now, whether or not he had conspirators helping him from the, we found out later he did. But as far as the actual shooter, there wasn't any doubt about who actually shot him. And then you fast forward to 1881, Charles Guiteau shoots Garfield right in the back at a train station downtown in Washington in full, it's broad daylight in full view of witnesses, arrested immediately, right? So the matter of who the shooter was never in doubt. His motive, we'll get to in a second, just like John Wilkes Booth motive, but there's no doubt about who the shooter was. And then you get to 1901, about 20 years later, Leon Solgois wraps his hand up in a bandage, and in a handshake line, he's got a pistol hidden under the bandage, shoots President McKinley at point blank range, again, in front of witnesses, broad daylight. Again, no question about who the shooter was. So, as far as crimes are concerned, if you're just talking about getting the shooter, in these three assassinations, there was never any doubt who did it. Now, you always want to establish motive, right? And so the motive, one of the reasons why there was immediate suspicion of a conspiracy behind John Wilkes Booth was it was so soon after the conclusion of the Civil War, and John Wilkes Booth was a Southerner. And it appeared to be an attempt by a Southern treasonous cabal, so to speak, to overthrow the results of the Civil War, to kill the king, so to speak. And what you couldn't achieve in war, you could achieve after the war, reverse the effects of the war, kind of a thing. As far as the Garfield assassination, there was no question about what happened in that situation because Charles Guiteau was an aggrieved constituent, an aggrieved former supporter of Garfield who had been promised a job by Garfield. And then and this is the old spoil system. In exchange for your support in the election, at the election, I'll give you a job or give you something. And then Garfield double crossed him. And Guiteau says, well, there's some people in this world you can double cross, but I'm not one of them. So he took a gun and enacted his revenge. And of course, you think about what the result of that is because that really opened the American people's eyes to this danger of the spoil system and brought about a bunch of reforms afterwards. The killing of Lincoln did not overturn the effects of the Civil War. It sort of hammered home the idea that Reconstruction was not going to be easy. The South was, even in peace, even after having surrendered, we're not going to go down easily. And then the third motive, the imperial presidency, Leon Solgos was upset with William McKinley. He was sort of known as our first imperial president, right? The Spanish-American War was uh, was foisted on the American people by the William McKinley administration. Remember, Teddy Roosevelt was the one who went over there and saved the day, and this was during McKinley's first term, so that when McKinley runs for re-election, the war hero coming back after the Spanish-American War is Teddy Roosevelt. So he puts him on the ticket to help him win that election. But he was known as the first imperial president. And, he was sort of the president that set us on a course, which we continue on to this day, which is to uh, look to create an empire, an overseas empire. And Leon Solgoy is obviously an immigrant himself, is not happy with that, and said, we didn't elect you to be king. You're not king. You don't get to just make these decisions unilaterally. In other words, it almost appears to me that Leon Solgoys was onto what the McKinley administration had done to fool the American people into that war. I'm not justifying what he did. I'm just saying he took issue with it. So these assassinations always have a purpose. Okay, throughout, in spite of our government's best efforts in the 60s to pawn off three very high profile assassinations during the 60s, first JFK, then MLK, then RFK, as uh, events that happened as a result of lone nuts who had just went off the reservation for their own reasons, whether we understand them or not, killed the president probably for attention, right? No, it's always much bigger than that. There's always a purpose to killing the king. There's so much risk involved. There's so much notoriety involved, and the history books will, you got to be prepared to deal with that. History books are going to have your name. And it's going to be this. Uh, it's not going to be. You're not going to be a heroic figure in American history, is what I'm trying to say. So you got to be prepared for that and understand that. Okay, it's a cost benefit analysis. These plotters, these conspirators, these cabals, these folks, these traitors willing to commit treason, up to and including assassinating the king, do so with a purpose in mind. They've weighed the cost and they decide benefits outweigh the costs, and so they go through with it. And uh, now, understand, as we've learned with the deep state, they're very good at immunizing themselves, right? But it still comes at great cost because you have to go through a lot of uh, planning, and a lot of effort goes into securing that immunity afterwards. It's expensive, right? Somebody has to pay for all this, and then you have to maintain control over the narrative afterwards. And if people come out, inconvenient witnesses come out afterwards, you have to deal with them. Uh, Researchers who come up with evidence, you have to deal with them. It's a very costly proposition. But on the flip side, as we've already learned with all the payoffs that LBJ gave to all his co-conspirators, you realize they're willing to pay that cost if they can get those benefits. So anyway, just a little backstory on the Secret Service. Uh, the question that we want to look at today is, with respect to Dallas, did the Secret Service have adequate warning that something could happen in Dallas? And the reason I want to answer that question before we get into all the details is because, you know, if the Secret Service has been so successful after its formation and after its mandate has been expanded to include presidential protection, that for 60 years, presidents have been safe. Then all of a sudden in 63, we see a president murdered in cold blood, broad daylight from a high powered rifle. And at first, it appears this is one of those fluke things that could happen to anybody, that maybe they should have left the top on the car and that would have protected. Then you start getting into it and you realize there's all these breakdowns in Secret Service protocols. And I mean, very obvious ones. And you start to ask yourself the question, is it just coincidental that on this day, for 60 years, they've protected the president with a perfect record? Then all of a sudden, on this day, there's all these breakdowns in Secret Service protocols. Was it because they got lax? Was it because they got lulled into a false sense of security, their perfect record for so long? Was it because there was no threat on the president's life that forced them to be on alert, or was it something else? So I guess that's the $1 million question. Was there any indication in advance that a Dallas could happen that should force or require or necessitate the Secret Service to be on high alert? Because as we get into this, you'll discover the Secret Service was decidedly not on high alert. And there's got to be a reason for that. I don't believe in coincidences. Uh, Here are some images of things that will make sense to you when we're finished with this presentation today. Uh, just a few. There's a memo there at the top, uh, uh, talking about threats that they should be aware of. This figure on the top right is an individual. It'll be important when we get to the discussion about Miami, as is also this bottom left picture of this group, these anti-Castro groups, which are seemingly omnipresent in the South during this period, and all have reason to hate the president. And then this Dallas controversy at this newspaper here about an FBI or a Dallas police lieutenant and a statement he allegedly made in the aftermath of the JFK assassination. Some more images here. And one of the things that the Secret Service banked on was this sort of inborn trust the American people had in the Secret Service, that of all the agencies in Washington that might have cause to want to participate in a treasonous plot like this, the Secret Service sort of held itself up as above the fray, that they would never, their only job is to protect the president. They would never stoop to a level where they would participate in a plot to overthrow the president, right? And the American people, it's sort of reflected in public opinion polls after the assassination that the Secret Service sort of gets a pass. It was just a bad day. Certainly, they were not complicit in any way, shape, or form. What I hope to achieve as we go through this is two things. First, to show the Secret Service is very much part of this national security apparatus, this deep state, but in 1963. And as such, is just as susceptible, is just as is it's just as able to participate in a plot like this as the CIA and the Pentagon. They're all part of the same apparatus. Their jobs are different, but ultimately their loyalties are not with the current president or the current office holder. They're with they have their own interests, and their own interests align more with these other deep state conspirators than they do with their own job description, which is to protect the president. So for the purposes of furthering their interests and their co-conspirators' interests, they are willing to, and I hope I can demonstrate this, they are willing to lay down on the job for a day to allow for an obstacle to the furtherance of their interests to be taken out. Now, they'll be very interested and very keen on immunizing themselves afterwards because they want to keep that trust American people have in them. It's only been here recent, where with the recent assassination attempts on Trump and stuff, where we start to see a pattern where when they find something, when when someone comes along, a president comes along that doesn't align with their interests, they are willing to lay down on the job and make it appear as though they're doing their job. They're very good at masking, disguising what they're doing. But and it hasn't been until recent that a lot of American people are starting to recognize a pattern or recognize similarities between what happens, for example, in Butler, Pennsylvania, a couple years ago, with Trump, and what happened in Dallas in 1963. We'll get into that. It's called security stripping. So the question with respect to the Secret Service, notwithstanding all the goodwill it had built up with the American people and the trust and the confidence, all that, the failures in Dallas were so blatant, were so obvious. The question is, where does coincidence and conspiracy begin? And I encourage you, as we get into this, to lay aside all of your presuppositional viewpoints about the Secret Service and just consider it as another one of these agencies that has its own interests, not its job. Set that aside for a second, but look at what its interests are and who it would be more allied with or more in agreement with. Because not all conspiracies are theories. Some of them are true. And, no one thought Brutus would be, he was supposedly Julius Caesar's best friend, right? One of them, close associate. And when Brutus was there in the treasonous cabal, stabbing Julius Caesar to death, remember the famous line, Julius Caesar looks over, sees his friend participating in the plot. Et tu, Brutus? You too, Brutus? And so that is sort of this one of the reasons it makes, in my view, the Secret Service a prime suspect because of the fact that no one suspects them. It's kind of like when the CIA used female agents to carry out some of its more high-profile missions. I'm thinking of ZR Rifle, for example. I mean, that's an assassination program. No one thinks of a woman being part of an assassination program. It's the perfect cover. Well, the Secret Service, no one has more access to the president than the Secret Service. No one has closer proximity to the president than the Secret Service. And in 1963, no one had more trust built up with the president and its job description of protecting the president than the Secret Service, which means if you can corrupt the Secret Service, you have the perfect co-conspirator. JFK would not have trusted the CIA with his protection, or the Pentagon, or LBJ. But he put his life in the hands of the Secret Service. All right. So the question is, was there anything that would cause the Secret Service or should have caused the Secret Service in the lead up to November 22nd, 1963, caused them to be suspicious or caused them at least be on high alert? And I'm going to start just in the month of November. So we're talking about a 30-day period, not even 30 days, because this is November 2 we're talking about, and we know he was assassinated on the 22nd. So we're talking about 20 days, less than 3 weeks. In a 3-week period before the assassination of JFK, we're going to discuss these events, everything that went into it, which should have put the Secret Service on high alert. By the way, one of my sources for all things related to Secret Service is Vince Palmera. He's kind of known as the Secret Service expert when it comes to JFK research. And he's on YouTube, but he's written some books about it. So I would encourage any of you that are interested in going deeper on this topic to get yourself a Vince Palmera book or listen to him on YouTube. He's a terrific source on this matter. There's others. We'll talk about others as well, but he's a primary go-to source. So on November 2, 1963, there was a plot in Chicago that goes back a couple days to the 31st. On the 31st of October, there was an informant tip to the FBI field office in Chicago, and the informant would only identify himself as Lee. Now, there's a lot of speculation about who that Lee is. I believe it was Lee Harvey Oswald. We know he was an FBI informant, and according to other sources, he was actively infiltrating plots to kill the president and reporting on them, trying to stop them. He stopped this one in Chicago. He also attempts to stop the one in Dallas, almost in the exact same manner. So I believe this was Lee Harvey Oswald. I can't prove it, but I believe it was. We know his name was Lee. Anyway, he passes along to the FBI field office information that there were 4 Cubans either already in Chicago or headed to Chicago, and their plan was to shoot Kennedy in his motorcade, which was scheduled to happen on the 2nd of November. It was almost an identical plan to Dallas. He was going to motorcade through the city amongst the tall, high buildings and end up at the Soldiers Field for it was either Army, Navy, or Navy Air Force. It was an armed services football game. And he was going to sort of be the guest of honor at that game. So, and of course, now the difference here is in Chicago on November 2, that's a cold weather city. So you wouldn't have the advantage you'd have in Dallas of taking off the bubble top. Most likely the bubble top was there. Now, the bubble top was not, as we've learned, it was not bulletproof. It was bullet resistant. But if you've ever had a watch that said water resistant versus waterproof, you know the difference. So you could shoot through it. It just made it easier not to have it on in Dallas. And it made sense because it was a warm day that day. But in Chicago on November 2nd, 1963, he would have probably been under some kind of roof. And that changes the plan slightly. But anyway, this was the plan. According to Lee, they were going to be set up in a tall office building and shoot him as he proceeded to the city in his motorcade. Almost an exact. Now, of course, they didn't have the benefit of hindsight like we do now. And we can look and we can compare it to Dallas and say it's the exact same plan. How come they were aware? Dallas hasn't happened yet. So they're not as familiar with the plan as we are. Nevertheless, Lee identifies for them the fact that there's 4 Cubans with high-powered rifles going to shoot him while he motorcaded through Chicago. That was the tip. Now, as the FBI begins pursuing this, ostensibly, they get another tip. And I believe it was the second tip that really spooked the plot. I think if it's left up to the FBI and its original tip, they could have covered that up. And we'll see that they tried. But the second tip is to the Chicago police. And this landlady comes to the Chicago police and says she had rented a room to 4 Cubans. This is completely unrelated to Lee's tip. Okay. This is just another concerned citizen. She says she rented a room to 4 Cubans. And when she went into the clean one day, on the bed were lying all these high-powered rifles with telescopic sights on these rifles. And on the bed next to the rifles was a map and an outline of the presidential motorcade. And there was ammunition and all kinds of stuff. So she goes to police with all this information. So the FBI now is made aware by the Chicago police of this this is a second tip or warning, and it jives with the first tip because she rented the room to 4 Cubans. Lee said 4 Cubans were on their way to Chicago to shoot Kennedy, and he says it's going to be a high-power rifle from distance, moving target during a motorcade. Well, she found high-power rifles. She found a map of the motorcade on the bed. So this is corroboration of the original tip. It's what it is. So the FBI passes these warnings on to the Secret Service. The Secret Service is planning to go ahead with the trip. It's when the White House finds out about the trip that they cancel it. Now, if you're the White House and you have you have notice in advance of a possible assassination attempt in Chicago. That means something to you. That means something to you because Chicago was home to the outfit, a crime syndicate led by that, it was the Tony Accardo family, but it was led by Sam Giancana. And the Kennedy family has history with Giancana. And in fact, they owe JFK's election victory in 1960 to Giancana and the outfit. And of course, the Kennedys know that since that victory, uh, during which was a culmination of a deal that had made between Danny Joe Kennedy and Sam Giancana. Well, Sam Giancana has fulfilled his part of the deal, and now it's up to Jack and his brother Bobby to fulfill their part of the deal. And they know privately that they have welched on their part of the deal. They have double crossed the crime syndicate in Chicago. So if there is a city in America that the Kennedys, the Kennedy White House, would be sensitive to an assassination plot, it is most definitely Chicago, Illinois. So they canceled the trip. It's interesting because there are other trips that they continue on and take, despite the fact that there are known assassination plots in those cities. And Kennedy plows ahead and goes on those trips. But when he hears about Chicago, or his those around him hear about an assassination plot, Chicago, the trip gets canceled. I don't think that is coincidental. I think that is sort of an anecdote that proves, at least in my mind, that the Kennedys are very aware. And when I say the Kennedys, I'm talking about Jack and his brother Bobby, are very aware of the anger and the hostility and the motive that the Chicago crime family would have towards them for having double crossed them in that deal that had been made 3 years earlier. So the fact that Chicago got canceled is because the Kennedys were very aware how dangerous Chicago was for them. So what happens next? Well, the Secret Service, which is surveilling these 4 Cubans, botches the surveillance. What happens was they made themselves too obvious, and it spooked 2 of the Cubans who fled the scene. They didn't come back to the apartment building and make themselves available to get arrested. 2 of them did. Now, at the time, all the records were destroyed, and we didn't find out 2 years later, or a little bit later, who those 2 were. And the only reason we found out who those 2 were is because of the testimony of a Secret Service agent who was stationed in Chicago and was in the building when they were brought in for interrogation, for questioning after their arrest. And he named the 2 Cubans. And they weren't both Cubans, one of them. The top one there is David Morales. He is a self-described CIA assassin. And the bottom one is Eugene James Hale Braden. He has several aliases, but usually goes by James Braden or Eugene Braden. And he has widely been described as David Morales' personal spotter. So all of these long-range shooters always have a spotter. And I used to think it was just for one purpose, and that was to alert them to the target, help them focus in on the target, whatever. But the spotter is important for several reasons. The spotter collects the shell casings as they come out of the rifle so that the shooter doesn't have to worry about it, right? Lose focus on his target, thinking about picking up the shell casings. The spotter just catches them, so they don't leave any evidence behind. Also, oftentimes it's the spotter who is handed the rifle after the shooting so that the shooter can walk away without anything in his hands. The spotter goes off in a separate direction, having broken down the gun, put it in his case or hidden it somewhere. These hits are not singular in nature. Another reason why the lone nut high-powered rifle shot from distance by Lee Harvey Oswald just doesn't make any sense. Uh, Remember now, one of the things that they said that they found in the sniper's nest was three shell casings dropped right there from the shooter's rifle because it was a lone nut. You didn't have time to pick up the shell casings. It was just preposterous. Uh, but anyway, these two names are going to figure prominently in Dallas 20 days later. The same two guys. I mean, Eugene Braden actually got arrested coming out of the Daltex building, and multiple witnesses saw that happen. So we know wherever James Braden is, David Morales is not far behind. So when Braden got arrested coming out of the Daltex building, very good indication, in addition to other evidence, that David Morales was the shooter in the Daltex building. But that's 20 days later. This is November 2, or regarding the November 2 plot. And these are the two unlucky ones that got arrested. They were detained. They didn't reveal any information because nothing had occurred. There's been no shooting. They were released. And the records of their detainment, they weren't even technically arrested. The records were destroyed. And so it's as if it never happened. Fortunately for us, Secret Service agent Abraham Bolden was there, and he witnessed them being brought in. Excuse me. And he was, as such, privy to the names of these two suspects. And when he released them later, after Dallas had happened, and after the confirmed presence of Braden and Morales in Dallas, it appears that these two, after their release, because the November 2 plot didn't work, just simply moved to the next available location where the plot was scheduled to happen and continued their mission uninterrupted. So anyway, we'll get more into that story later, but so two of them got away and two of them were arrested or detained. Meanwhile, all this is happening. There's a man running around Chicago making loud threats against the president. And he's also being surveilled. His name is Thomas Arthur Valley. And unbelievable. It reminds me so much. Think about this as we talk about Thomas Arthur Valley. He's running around Chicago making threats against the president, which is illegal, but he's doing it. And he's drawing attention to himself. It's similar to all those doppelgangers in the lead up to the November 22 assassination in Dallas, running around pretending to be, claiming to be Lee Harvey Oswald, doing things that will later be communicated back to the law enforcement, that paints a very incriminating picture of Lee Harvey Oswald. And we all know, if you've watched me for any length of time, we all know Lee Harvey Oswald was a patsy. So the fact that Thomas Arthur Valley is doing similar things, running around talking loudly and openly about assassinating the president, this is in the lead up to November 2, which is supposed to be D-Day, where the president is actually assassinated. It leads me to believe that this is the Chicago patsy, and he is being set up, and if the assassination takes place like it's supposed to, all these people are going to come out of the woodwork saying, "Oh yeah, he said something. He threatened the president, or he said something about the president, which clearly indicated he hated him, or he threatened him. I heard him say something like he was going to assassinate, he was going to shoot the president." All this, it was going to paint a very guilty picture, right? So he's running around publicly. He's doing that. He's being surveilled. Now that the trip has been called off by the White House, there's no plot anymore. They're not coming to Chicago. So they arrest this guy, ostensibly for making threats against the president. But he had been making threats all the while, and they hadn't arrested him. They just surveilled him. They followed him around. Now the plot is called off. They arrest him. He's on his way to work, and he worked stop me if you've heard this before, in a high-rise office building that was perfectly situated next to the motorcade route. Sound familiar? Anyway, they searched his apartment. They found a rifle. They found ammunition. They found a handgun. They searched his car. They found another rifle. They found 750 rounds of ammunition. And in the midst of all this, threats against the president, that's illegal. I'm sure the fact that he had all these rifles and handguns and ammunition in his apartment, in his car, there's got to be some sort of maybe it was all legal. I don't know. Uh, but 90 minutes after his arrest, they released him after he paid a $5 fine for a hunting knife that he had on his car seat. So, and then he just disappears into the ether. He's just gone. Uh, a researcher, I don't know, I think it was in the 80s. I tell this story later when I'm talking about this story in depth. Give you the name of the guy. He's writing a book. He's trying to write a book about the Chicago Patsy, but he can't find him. He can't find a death notice. You know what? It's like he ceased to exist after this event here in Chicago. And he searches and he searches and he searches. He finally finds him out in Phoenix, Arizona, living as a one of those. It's a protected witness. He was in the witness protection program. They changed his name, his identity, everything. Moved him out to Phoenix, Arizona, and basically started a new life. Now, the question that he had, which occurs to me as well, is why was he in witness protection? There's no record of him ever testifying in a trial against anybody. There's no record of him having provided any kind of evidence that convicted somebody who might be a danger to him going forward. Why was he in witness protection other than to hide him away after this Chicago plot didn't work out? But it's clear that he was being set up and that this boisterous manner in which he was going around making threats against the president was going to be used against him later. And when he was arrested, it was to get him out of town because the plot was off. He was no longer necessary, was no longer needed, and to hide him away so he didn't say anything. It's the only conclusion I can come to. It's awful odd that he was not charged with making threats against the president, despite the fact there were many witnesses to it. It's awful odd that with all the ammunition and weapons they found in his possession, both in his car and his apartment, he was not charged with any of that. He was charged with having a hunting knife on his car seat, and he paid a $5 fine, disappeared, literally disappeared. Just to drive home this fact that he was the equivalent of Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas. He was the Chicago version. Look at the similarities between the two of them. Both Thomas Arthur Valley and Lee Harvey Oswald, ex-Marines, both served at a U-2 base overseas. Oswald famously served at Camp Atsugi, which is in Japan. It's a CIA base. Thomas Arthur Valley served at Camp Atsu in Japan, also a CIA base. He was portrayed as, both of these are portrayed as anti-Kennedy lone nuts. Both were trained as anti-Castro, both participated in the training of anti-Castro Cubans. That's a CIA function. All the anti-Castro groups down in Miami were being trained by the CIA. Right prior to the November 2 plot, Thomas Arthur Valley moved from Long Island to Chicago. It was in August. So figure August, September, October, about 3 months prior. Well, same thing with Lee Harvey Oswald. He moves prior to the assassination of November 22 from New Orleans to Dallas. It's almost like they're being relocated or reassigned. And then both of them were placed in tall buildings. Thomas Arthur Valley was placed in the IPP Little Plate Company, which overlooked, as I mentioned, JFK's proposed motorcade route. It was adjacent to the route, and there was a perfect triangulation kill zone, which included, drum roll, a 90-degree turn in front of his building in the motorcade. And of course, we all know what, with Lee Harvey Oswald, he was placed in a tall building, Texas School Book Deposit, overlooking the Mirage, adjacent to a perfect triangulation kill zone, and right in front of a 90-degree turn in front of his building. So many similarities here. By the way, if you want to look up the history of Roscoe White, whom I believe was the Grassy Knoll shooter, and compare it to Lee Harvey Oswald, a lot of similarities there, almost identical. It's like they had a pool of assets, the CIA did, that they drew from for these missions. And they all had similar backgrounds, similar training. So that was November 2. So the plot doesn't happen because of this information from this tip by Lee, but also from this landlady. But important things to remember, the two that were arrested, David Morales and Eugene Braden, both end up in Dallas 20 days later. And the third guy that was arrested, the Patsy, Thomas Arthur Valley, is almost identical in every way that you can measure to the Patsy in Dallas. So many similarities. Almost like Chicago was a dry run for Dallas. Didn't occur there, so they moved on to the next city. But the stalking continues on November 16th. So 2 weeks after that, JFK is vacationing at his Palm Beach family compound, pictured here. And Cuban exiles, who by this point hate Kennedy because he's betrayed him so many times, rent the house next to the Kennedy compound, and they blast loud Cuban music at Kennedy all weekend. Just uninterrupted, loud music, Cuban music, almost like they're trying to let Kennedy know where we can reach you or out and touch you anytime we want. And it was so aggravating that Kennedy left early. He just couldn't stand it any longer. I mean, you're a president of the United States and you can't even prevent your neighbors from harassing you like this. But that happened on the 16th. On the 18th, he was scheduled to go to Tampa Bay. And he was, again, going to do a 27-mile motorcade through Tampa. And the motorcade is going to go right in front of this tall hotel, the Floridian Hotel. And again, this hotel is right in front of the motorcade routes, right adjacent to it, right adjacent to a perfect triangulation kill zone. When I say triangulation, understand that I don't believe any of the assassinations, plural, that are being planned here involved one shooter. I believe it involved teams of shooters, most likely 3 teams, where they could catch the target in a crossfire. And the reason I believe that is A, how it happened in Dallas. It was at least 3 locations. I mean, you just look at the shots, right? First one hit in the front neck, second one hit him in the back, third one hit him in the side. Front, back, side. 3 locations, 3 teams. But you understand how the S-Force had been training this assassination team that Nixon put together back in 59. And it was called the Triangular Fire Team. And they were training to kill Castro using high-powered rifles and scopes, shooting him from distance and hitting a moving target. They were doing all their training in Mexico. And this is the assassination team. This is the training that had been turned first against Castro, but then when Kennedy became the bigger part of the problem, they just switched their target from Castro to Kennedy. So all of these assassination plots involve triangulated fire, including the one in Chicago. Remember, David Morales and Eugene Hale Braden were two of the people of a four-man team. You said, well, where's the others? Well, I don't know. That might have just been two of the three teams, and we just aren't aware of the third team. There were shooters in Dallas that weren't aware of each other. So stands to reason there'd be shooters in these other locations that weren't be aware of each other as well. But anyway, this hotel, just like the office building in Chicago, just like the Texas School Book Depository building in Dallas, this hotel in Tampa was right at the pivotal location. 90-degree turn right in front of this building. Now, we found out about this plot from Santos Trafficante, who, when he found out that this plot had been made known to the authorities through a leak, he called off the hit. Now, Trafficante is the crime boss operating out of Tampa. He controls the state of Florida. So this information didn't come out to the Watergate scandal when his attorneys were trying to protect James McCord, one of the Watergate burglars, and were asking him, their client, why there was all these Cubans with their client, James McCord, burglarizing the Watergate Hotel. And since they knew all of these Cubans came from Florida, they were Santos's men. So they're asking Santos, why are your men in the Watergate Hotel up in Washington with our client, James McCord? And so he starts telling the backstory of all these different assassination plots, up to and including the JFK assassination plot in Dallas. And he's telling them the story of how, well, we tried to get him burst in Tampa, but it leaked, so I called it off. And he gives details, and the details are exactly the same as what happened in Dallas 4 days later. This is the 18th. And it matches up with what had been planned to have occurred in Chicago 16 days earlier. He even named the patsy in Tampa. All of these plots have a patsy. We know about Oswald because the plot succeeded there. These plots, we don't know about the patsy because they didn't succeed. So the patsies disappeared. Thomas Arthur Valley ends up in Phoenix, Arizona, living under an assumed a new name, new identity. This guy's name was Gilberto Policarpo Lopez, a Cuban exile who was affiliated with the same Fair Play for Cuba group that Lee Harvey Oswald is associated with. What you'll notice about a lot of these folks that are going to get blamed for the assassination or would have been blamed is that they have ties to Cuba. The assassination of Kennedy was a false flag. Excuse me, it's Operation Northwoods. That's what it is. A false flag with all the evidence pointing to Cuba as being the antagonizer or the source of the plot, so that it would justify an invasion of Cuba. It was all about going to war with Cuba, overthrowing Castro and his government, et cetera, et cetera. So just like the false flag against Spain, USS Maine, again in Cuba, which happened before the turn of the century, which was designed to get the American people all inflamed, mad at Spain for sinking the USS Maine, when in reality, we sank our own ship, blamed it on Spain, but it resulted in a war. It had worked so many times when they presented this. The reason I use that example, when they presented this Operation Northwoods to Kennedy, they referenced the USS Maine as having been so successful, a false flag, that they wanted to copy it and bomb shopping malls in Miami, kill people in schools, and bring down airliners, and kidnap John Glenn, and attack our fort down in Cuba, Guantanamo, all these things. They're going to blame Cuba for it. The bottom line was they were going to attack an American target on American, mostly either on American soil or Cuban soil that is American controlled, like Guantanamo, attack an American target on American soil and blame Cuba for it. So here you have this Cuban exile. So he's tied to Cuba. He attends Fair Play for Cuba meetings, which means he's a Castro guy, right? Just like Oswald. One day after, according to Santos Trafficani, one day after JFK was assassinated, 4 days later in Dallas, Lopez was flown out of the country to Mexico City, and eventually Fair Play for Cuba loaned him the money to go back to Cuba. And he was the only passenger on the plane. Now, if you are aware of a story I told about the doppelganger who disappeared from Dallas and on a plane that took him down to the border, where he disappeared afterwards. It is very consistent with how this guy disappeared. In the aftermath of the successful assassination, all these doppelgangers or all these patsies that needed to be dispensed with or disappeared. I gave you the story. It was from that the guy in the Air Force, I think it was the Air Force, Vincent, who got, by dumb luck, ended up on the same plane with this doppelganger. It rerouted, was headed out to Colorado. It rerouted in midair from Chicago, flew down to Dallas. It landed in this remote location, picked up this doppelganger. And he had no reason to recognize him or think anything about him until later, after the assassination. He gets home, he's watching on TV, he sees the picture, he says, "That's the guy I was flying with." And they didn't go to Colorado; they went down to to New Mexico somewhere, and I can't remember the name of it. It was where they all the UFO sightings were. Anyway, they landed there. The airport was under complete lockdown. He had to wait several hours, catch a bus, and eventually make it to Colorado. But then he tells this story about how he was on this plane with this Lee Harvey Oswald lookalike, and it was just where they landed was just a few miles from the border. So the suspicion is he just disappeared over the border. Well, this guy, a little bit after, one day after this JFK was assassinated in Dallas, was flown out of the country to Mexico City, probably the same place where the guy Vincent rode on the plane with was going, and eventually flown back to Cuba. This is according to Santos Trafficani. So there's just so many. If you put these puzzle pieces together, there's so many similarities with, for example, the triangle fire team, and the fact that all of these involve triangulation. The similarities of the patsies from city to city, the Chicago patsy, the Dallas patsy, the disappearing of these patsies afterwards, or the disappearing of in similar fashions. One ends up with a new identity. He's the only white guy, he's the white guy. Ends up out in Phoenix, Arizona. These other, they're, if you know the story of June Cobb, you understand she was idling her airplane at the airfield in Dallas, Redbird Airfield, waiting for a special passenger. Roscoe White was supposed to get arranged for Lee Harvey Oswald to end up at Redbird Airfield so he could be flown out. The doppelganger is flown out, according to Vincent, ends up on the border of Mexico, with him sitting there right next to him. Right? And here we have this Lopez guy. He gets flown out to Mexico City, ends up in Cuba. That's why I say these plots involve, it's ridiculous to think it's a lone gunman. These plots involve a lot of moving parts, a lot of people participating in order to prepare the field of fire in advance, carry out the mission, and then disappear everybody afterwards. So that's November 18th. And of course, the Secret Services, in this case, is made aware of it when the plot is revealed to the authorities. They didn't cancel the trip, but they're made aware of it. Again, that speaks to that Kennedy, The White House wasn't as afraid of Tampa as it was Chicago. Now, according to Santos Trafficante, here I've compared the two patsies side by side, the Tampa patsy, the Dallas patsy. The contingency plan was in Dallas. This is why they had to get Lopez out of the country in Dallas. Lopez served as the patsy in Tampa, but he was also on site in Dallas 4 days later. Because if the government had to admit to a front shot, rumors were that Lopez was going to be arrested as Oswald's co-conspirator, firing from the front. And that all that information that the FBI, the CIA, and the Secret Service had of the Tampa plot and this guy Lopez and his involvement was all hid from the Warren Commission. And this includes the Chicago plot as well. So think you're the Warren Commission, you're studying the assassination of JFK in Dallas. It would be helpful to be able to compare and contrast like we are. I, you know, I'm not an investigator. I'm not an attorney, but I'm asking these questions and I'm noticing these similarities. Do you think for a moment trained investigators and attorneys would not pick that out in a heartbeat? So the FBI just hides it. The Warren Commission arrives at a conclusion. Of course, we now know they began with the conclusion, work backwards, and they're not even aware that there was a plot against JFK's life on November 2nd in Chicago, and the guys who were detained and the guy who was arrested. That might be useful information, especially the part about the two that were detained, because they have an arrest record from Dallas police that one of those guys was arrested in Dallas too. Braden was arrested in Chicago and Dallas. That would have been helpful information, don't you think? But Warren Commission was unaware, blithely unaware of anything that happened in Tampa and this guy Lopez. They're just studying in a vacuum what happened in Dallas as if it's the only thing that mattered. The same day, there's a second plot against JFK. This one's in Miami. He's this little history here. From an electoral standpoint, JFK has already decided he's going to dump LBJ from the ticket 64. He needs to win 3 southern states to win re-election. And he's going to focus, actually 2. He's going to focus on Florida and Texas. He figures dumping LBJ from the ticket might cost him some southern votes, southern support. If he can just keep Texas and Florida, so he's going to go back and forth, back and forth. He's going to make trip after trip to Texas and Florida. So here he is. He went for the weekend to Palm Springs. That was a disaster. Then he goes in the morning to Tampa. And by virtue of the fact that the plot leaked, Santos calls it off. Otherwise, we might be talking about Tampa like we talk about Dallas. And in the afternoon, he goes to Miami. Now, on the 15th of Miami, so this is 3 days prior, there was a memo. We know about this because we've seen the memo. It's documented from a Miami detective named S.J. Abert. He had received a phone call from Agent Jameson of the Secret Service because the Secret Service had gotten word that there was an FBI informant named William Somerset that had said something that was interesting to the Secret Service. Now, Somerset was a longtime FBI informant in Miami. He reported on the activities of white supremacy groups. And he had secretly recorded a conversation just days earlier that he passed on to the FBI, and the FBI forwarded it to the Secret Service. So this guy, Agent Jameson, is the guy at the Secret Service the information gets passed to. So he's calling Miami because he wants to talk to this informant himself personally. And the informant in this whole scenario involves this guy named Joseph Miltier, pictured here top right. Also, if you look at the bottom picture, there's an arrow. These are the streets of Dallas. You can see the limo there, JFK, his wife Jackie. Connolly's turning there. This is on a street level, and we're not for sure 100%, but that looks like Miltier right there in the crowd. You'll see why it's relevant here in a minute. Anyway, he was a member of the White Citizens Council in Georgia. So, as such, since William Somerset mission or job description for the FBI is to report on the activities of white supremacy groups, Joseph Miltier would be a contact of his. On November 5th, 10 days before, Agent Jameson calls Miami to set up this conversation with Somerset. According to Somerset, he had a conversation with Miltier on November 5th, 1963, during which Kennedy, Miltier informed him that Kennedy was a, quote, marked man. And when Somerset asked Miltier how this would go down, Miltier replied, quote, from an office building with a high-powered rifle. So if you're the Secret Service and this information arrives on your desk, like it did Agent Jameson, you're going to want to call and talk to this guy and learn more about it. So on the 15th, he makes the call to Miami. On the 16th, a group identifying itself as the Cuban Commandos mailed a threat to the chief of police of Miami. And in this threat, it was laid out that they were going to assassinate JFK. Not just JFK. It's a direct quote. Quote, the Cuban Commandos have the bombs ready for killing JFK and Mayor King High, either at the airport or the convention hall. So it's leaking, just like it did in Tampa. Santos calls it off in Tampa. The Miami police, instead of notifying the Secret Service or the FBI, they keep it to themselves because on November 2, they had seen what happened when the White House found out about a plot in Chicago. They canceled the trip. So they don't want the trip to be canceled. Let me rephrase that. The Secret Service learned that they did not share it with the White House. That's what happened. So the Secret Service is made aware of this threat in Miami, but they do not share it with the White House. They had shared it with the White House in Chicago, and the trip had gotten canceled. This time they did not share it with the White House. And so the trip proceeded along, but the Secret Service changed the plans. Instead of flying in and landing at the airport, which according to the threat, that's where the bombs were, he flew in and he literally landed by helicopter on a baseball diamond, like a little league field. And he was only in Miami 4 hours, minimizing his exposure. And none of these plots were ever shared by Secret Service, by FBI, by Miami Police, by Tampa, enough with the Warren Commission. So if you're the Warren Commission and you're examining what happened in Dallas only 4 days later, it would have been helpful to know, to create a context, that there were 2 plots in Florida on the 18th, just 4 days prior. Then on the 16th, he'd spent his weekend at Palm Beach. I think it was the 16th. Let's go back and look. Yeah, it was the 16th. He'd spent his weekend at Palm Beach being harassed by Cubans. And on the 18th, there was a plot in Tampa, and there was a plot in Miami. And if you backdate it to the 2nd, there was a plot in Chicago. And the Warren Commission was unaware of any of it because it was never shared with them. Now, I started off today's episode saying, asking the question, was there any indication that JFK's life was at risk, was in danger? Were there any threats? Was there any reason to suspect that there was a active plot was following JFK around, stalking him? And the answer is clearly yes. Um, and was the Warren Commission later made aware of any of this? No, it was hidden from them. Now, the Secret Service, having been aware of what happened in Chicago, having been aware of what happened, they were there on site at Palm Beach. They experienced what JFK experienced with the harassment. And then having been aware of the two plots in Tampa and Miami on the 18th, should have been on high alert going into Dallas, especially Dallas, because Dallas was like the most hostile city in the South towards JFK. And I'll give all kinds of examples of that. But instead of ratcheting up the security, they stripped away all the security and opened up the limo to a field of fire, literally leading JFK like a lamb to the slaughter, in spite of everything that had happened in the 3 weeks prior. Now, Abraham Bolden is a hero in this. He's the only Secret Service agent ever offered the Warren Commission any information relating to prior knowledge of assassination plots. He had specific knowledge of what happened in Chicago because he was from Chicago. That was his home office. And you're going to find out what happened to this. He's basically a whistleblower. The Secret Service moved heaven and earth to hide all this from the Warren Commission so as to preserve their credibility with the American people, to preserve their credibility with future presidents, and just keep their culpability to a minimum of having been asleep at the switch or just having had a bad day. Anybody can have a bad day, but that they were not involved in any conspiracy or any plot. In 1992, the AARB requested these threat sheets the Secret Service keeps relating to any threats to President Kennedy in the fall of 63. And this is, you're talking about 30 years later. And the Secret Service, according to Judge Tynan, pictured here, who was the chairman of the AARB, the Secret Service still in 92 refused to release the documents. It also refused, according to Judge Tynan, to sign an AARB document stating that it was swearing under oath that it had released all documents related to the JFK assassination. Now, in my experience researching this topic, cover up is the first sign, and it's like the most convincing sign that they have something to hide. It has something to hide. We love to throw stones at the CIA because it's famous for hiding things, for covering up. But the Secret Service was engaged in a massive cover up after Dallas and is still engaged in that cover up to this day so as to protect its reputation, right? We're Lily White. Our job is to protect the president. There's a lot of threats out there. We do our best, unless we don't. And I think it's important to understand that the Secret Service had its own motives, and we're going to get into that. And it is just as much a part of the deep state, this national security apparatus, as the CIA is, as the FBI is, as the Pentagon is. And just like LBJ's involvement was necessary to carrying out this plot and immunizing themselves afterwards, the Secret Service was necessary absolutely crucial to the carrying out of this plot as well. Because if the Secret Service doesn't want you to get access to the president, you're not going to get access to the president. You're not going to get close enough to take a shot. You say, well, what about high-powered rifle? Well, there's ways to mitigate against that. You're not supposed to take them down city streets surrounded by tall buildings. In every one of these plots, they routed the motorcade to go through the city amongst the tall office buildings. In every one of these plots, it involved a 90-degree turn in front of the building where they had the patsy set up. No protocols, Secret Service, there's not supposed to be any 90-degree turns in any motorcade. They're supposed to maintain a minimum speed. I think it's like 26, 28 miles an hour. But you almost have to come. The one in Dallas was like a 120-degree turn. You almost have to come to a complete stop. And so there are ways to mitigate against high range or high power rifle shots from distance. And yet none of that. And they even had advance notice because in Chicago, the tip was it's going to be a high power rifle shot distance on the motorcade. Now they know. I remember when 9/11 happened, one of the parts that took Americans by such surprise was the fact that you could use a jetliner as a weapon, an airline plane as a weapon. But now we know. We should have known. Kamikazes happened all the way back in World War II. It just was hard to conceive of. We never seen it. And all of a sudden, 9/11, we saw it. Well, in Chicago, they were made aware of the exact template what took place in Dallas. In Tampa, they were made aware of the exact template which was going to later happen in Dallas. And yet it happened anyway. And the Secret Service, you say, well, you got to give them some credit. They stopped the plot in Chicago. No, they didn't. The White House did. They canceled the trip. And in Tampa, they didn't stop the plot. Santos Trafficante called it off because it leaked. Now, in Miami, they were successful in keeping JFK safe by changing the plans where he didn't land at the airport. He lands at the ball field by helicopter instead of by plane. But as far as the plots involving a motorcade, a patsy, high range or long range shot, high power rifles from distance, involving triangulated, all three of those plots, the Secret Service was not, you can't credit them for anything having protected JFK. It's just dumb luck that Chicago didn't work. It was dumb luck again. Tampa didn't work. By the time we get to Dallas, when Lee again tries to inform and let the authorities know, just like he did Chicago, that there was a similar plot to Chicago fixing to happen in Dallas, they buried that sucker. By the time we get to Dallas, they had made the decision. It has to work this time. So I think the upshot of today's episode is the Secret Service is every bit as part of this deep state cabal, has different motives, but has as much importance to the plot as LBJ, as the Pentagon, as the CIA. If you don't have the Secret Service involved, you're not going to get close enough to kill the president. If you have Secret Service complicity, you now can get as close to the president as you want. I saw something. If you can't get close enough to the target, you bring the target to be close to you. So the rerouting of the motorcade in Dallas to include the Texas School Book Depository. If you look at the original route, it's supposed to go straight on Main Street to the Stemmons Freeway, but instead they add a 90-degree turn onto Houston and then a 120-degree turn onto Elm, slowing the motorcade down to a virtual stop. And the Secret Service was involved in that decision. So, all right, that's the beginning of this chapter. Just wanted to give you a little background and talk about the danger that Kennedy was in, Secret Service was fully aware of, so that you understand that when Dallas happens and we start talking about all these breakdowns in protocols, they don't make sense given the context. They do not make sense. Probably why they didn't reveal all that to the Warren Commission, because if the Warren Commission had been aware of Chicago, had been aware of Tampa, had been aware of Palm Springs, had been aware of Miami, they would have asked the same question. Well, if all this was happening, why on earth did you not protect the president in Dallas? You knew he was under threat. So they just withheld all that information so that Dallas appears to be the only trouble spot. You got to study Dallas in a vacuum. But Dallas didn't happen in a vacuum. And the Secret Service is the one agency that's only job was to protect the president. And as such, was fully aware of the context, fully aware, and I believe fully complicit in the participation in the plot that it culminated in Dallas. All right, that's enough for today. Join me next time. We continue on with the Secret Service, part of the deep state treasonous cabal. Until next time, God bless. Thank you.